Cool. So Allison, can you give us the overview of MAASU?
Yeah, so MAASU is an intercollegiate organization. It stands for the Midwestern Asian American Student Union. It's student-led, and we seek to empower and engage students attending universities across the Midwest. We hold 2 conferences per academic years, and we hope to foster the community between the PITA students in the Midwest through political awareness and activism.
Yes, so that is MAASU, and just a quick overview of why we're holding this town hall. For those, maybe just like a refresher for those who forgot or for those who don't really know, DACA stands for the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals Program, which is a program that President Obama enacted in order to provide undocumented immigrants the chance to have employment and education opportunities without the threat of deportation. But as you might know, President Trump recently redacted the DACA program, and Congress has 6 months, now 5 months, to act before the protections by DACA are uplifted. So that's why we're having this town hall to talk about action steps that we as students and our organizations can take in order to kind of fight back and fight for the rights of documented citizens, or documented population. So we do have 2 amazing panelists with us today, and Allison can introduce them. And panelists, when they say your name, you can just wave.
Okay, so first we got Ken Gonzales. He's an artist, activist, and advocate. He currently lives in Washington, D.C. and works as the Program and Operations Coordinator at the Asian Pacific American Labor Alliance, APALA, and the Institute for Asian Pacific American Leadership and Advancement. He is a proud alumnus of the University of Minnesota Twin Cities and holds a degree in African American and African Studies. Beyond that, Kenneth is a committed yogi, an avid reader of memoirs, and a #Chandala land fanatic. Our second panelist is Madison Villanueva. I'm so sorry if I pronounced that wrong. Did I, Madison?
It's Villanueva, but you're good.
Villanueva. Okay. So she's a recent graduate from the UC Santa Barbara. She's a member of the UPLIFT-Los Angeles, an undocumented and Asian Pacific Islander API youth-led organization based in Los Angeles. Through UPLIFT, Madison has helped bring together a coalition of undocumented APIs. She enjoys adventuring to find the best food places, especially with tacos, boba, and ice cream. And then we also had a third panelist named Guadalupe, but unfortunately she could not make it.
Okay, so we could just get started with our panel questions. And just to reiterate, if you have any questions while our panelists are speaking, direct them to Daphne Chang, and then we will address them at the end. All right, so to our panelists, you guys can whoever wants to speak first, maybe just raise your hands and then you can just go. So our first question is, can you share how you started getting involved with organizing around issues regarding the documented community?
Andy, you want to start?
Okay, I'll start. Hi, everyone. Again, my name is Ken. Thank you all for inviting me to be a part of this panel. So just, I guess, really quickly, it was my organizing as a student at the University of Minnesota that really developed my political analysis in immigrant rights work and its connections to other issues. And more personally, had grown up undocumented for 17 years of my life until most recently. So the issue at hand has both been a very political and personal issue for as much as I have really lived in the United States.
Hi, everyone. Again, my name is Madison. And with me, I started organizing a few years back in 2013 because I got this internship called Dream Summer. It's a national internship based in, or it's put together by UCLA Labor Center. And through there, I met a lot of people who were organizers, organized for the undocumented community. And then we connected with an organization called Aspire Los Angeles, and it's the same organization that I'm a part of now. We changed their name recently to UPLIFT. And I really appreciated the type of work that Aspire LA did, because I didn't know of any Asian Pacific Islander undocumented immigrant organization, specifically to organize undocumented APIs. And so through there, I just kept getting more involved. And when I started college at University of California, Santa Barbara, I also joined my student organization there.
Awesome. And then also, what are some tangible action steps that we can take as individuals or as a campus or as the APIA community?
Yeah, I can start that. So I work for the Asian Pacific American Labor Alliance, and we're a national API advocacy-based organization, doing both on-the-ground organizing as well as legislation on the Hill. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the pieces of legislation that I think students should be aware of. I know the framing of this particular conversation was around DACA, but I think it's important to also pivot the conversation from DACA to the DREAM Act. So the DREAM Act is a piece of legislation that undocumented communities have been fighting for over 16, 17 years now, really, and has really been something that has been at the forefront of conversations within immigrant rights work. So now bringing back DREAM Act again, because of what happened with DACA, has been gaining a lot of momentum across the aisle, both from Democrats and from Republicans. So right now, I think one of the core asks that students can have, I think especially for universities in states that have a Republican-controlled Senate or Republican-controlled districts, one of the pieces of work that you can ask is to literally take out your phone and call your members of Congress. Call your members of Congress, urge that your members of Congress sign on to the DREAM Act, which is a piece of legislation that would grant over 3 million undocumented youths a pathway to citizenship, in order for them to no longer live in fear, in order for them to be able to stay and work and live and do the things that I think most people take for granted purely because of citizenship or permanent residency. So that's one. I think one is call your members of Congress. I think the second one, and then I think Madison can talk a little bit more about this part too, but I think the second, sometimes we get really focused on legislation. And the other piece that I think, especially on campus and as students, that you all can do is find ways where you are able to create support networks and support groups for undocumented students within your universities, and that can go, that kind of support can go in a lot of different ways, both from advocacy efforts where you're calling on administration to set up, for example, student support centers for undocumented folks. I know there's a lot in California where there's undocumented student support centers. There's schools in the East Coast, but I know in the Midwest that kind of need continues to that there's a continuous need for it, but there's still not enough pressure, I think, on students to really ask of their administrators to have that for their students. So it can go from administrative ask and administration ask to on the ground, where if you know and you have friends or friends of friends or community members who are undocumented whose DACAs may be expiring, even in the long run, being able to create and set up emergency funds so that when shit hits the fan, and it already has, that there are resources for students to be able to just do the basic things like eat, and to be able to sleep and live to live somewhere. So I think I'll sum it up, but I think there's a legislative piece in calling your members of Congress to push them to push them to pass the DREAM Act. There is an administrator, like at your university, to call on administrators to create systemic changes so that undocumented students can feel supported. And then there's the community support, that when things start to feel worse, that there's at least a community there for them to lean on when it comes to emotional, physical, financial support, whatever that may be.
So I think Ken was pretty spot on tangible ways that folks can help. I do want to expand a little bit on the types of support that folks in universities can give. So like I mentioned before, I was involved with the undocumented student organization at my campus when I was there. And I also worked at our resource center, because in the University of California system, students won basically a resource center to be opened in every campus. And so in all 9 campuses of the UC system, there's a resource center for undocumented students. And through there's some have more, but each one has at least one staff and a student team to put together things like workshops that go on every year. And the workshops can cover topics from things like know your rights to financial aid, even financial literacy, so folks know how to budget their money when they have it. We are able to give out scholarship opportunities to folks, and I think that's just one way that universities, if you have a good relationship with your administrators, to be able to give, because one of the issues that will never ever change for undocumented folks is money. And that kind of goes along with what Ken was saying with starting an emergency fund, and that can be started either with like something that's institutionalized within your campus, or something that is more informal that student organizations can do. So I know that I graduated from Santa Barbara back in June, but I still keep in touch with folks that are there. And I wasn't on campus anymore by the time DACA was rescinded, but there were still a lot of people that contacted me asking if it was possible to fundraise for undocumented folks in Santa Barbara. And I think that was one way that folks really helped. And I don't know how much money they raised and how many people they were able to help when it came to DACA, but when those funds were raised, they ended up being used for other things later on too. So another example was a friend of mine who's also a member of UPLIFT. She fundraised individually for people that she knew, because she was well connected, not just from people in her city, but from around the country. And she fundraised on her own. She got a lot of money, helped out as many people as she could, but she still had extra money. And so when I went to an action recently, someone was arrested and held in jail for and could only be released by bail. She actually ended up fronting the money for it because she had that money. And it seems like I think it's things like that that really show that emergency funds really help, or emergency relief funds really help for folks, because you never know what could happen. And when it comes to also, I know Ken touched on this a little bit too, just on the ground community support. I know that in my university, we also dealt with a lot of really awful conservative white students who would try to intimidate us, make us feel unwelcome. There was an issue last year where there would be graffiti all over campus with anti-immigrant sentiment, a lot of transphobic and homophobic and just sexist things too. And a lot of folks ended up like holding space for us, so providing like circles where folks can just talk, or also like spaces that aren't well publicized, so people who aren't seeking that support don't know about it, and people can just chill there or study or nap or something, and usually there's food, just because I don't know, in my experience in college too, was that people are always struggling with food security. So those spaces that also really help.
The one thing I'll also add, as in terms of at least organizations, I know MAASU did a statement, and I believe Minnesota, the Asian American Student Union at Minnesota did one as well. But even just being able to release statements of support from your organization, at least so that undocumented students know where on campuses there are support for them. So I think even as simple as that can sometimes go a really long way.
Yeah, I definitely second that, just because I feel like there's a lot more hate that's visible than there is support. So definitely don't be afraid to be vocal, because you have nothing to lose in, showing your support for folks.
Awesome, thank you guys. So just to reiterate, the points that you hit were writing statements of support, fundraising, creating safe spaces or spaces where people can be comfortable in just staying or sharing their experiences, and hosting maybe Know Your Rights workshops that are really helpful. Is there anything else that comes to mind or that you haven't covered in terms of how we can provide support to those who are documented?
I mean, on an individual level, educate yourselves on the issues, right? I think that's at the very least what all of us can do, and learn about the experiences, not just of broadly undocumented people, but of the different experiences and nuances that exist with undocumented Latinx communities, undocumented API communities, undocumented Black folks, because there can sometimes be a very broad paintbrush that's created of all of the community's experiences, and that's not always the case, and most often is not the case. So just being able to kind of create opportunities of education around it, so that undocumented folks don't have to do the labor for you.
Mm-hmm. And that's also, just going off on that, when I was an intern at our research center, something that I really wanted to push was inviting undocumented folks to our events, to either, there are a lot of undocumented artists and scholars who would love to present their work. And so it's also a way of supporting those individuals by, providing them financial opportunities and show their work. But it was a really good way for folks to learn the different nuances, like Ken was saying, about the undocumented community, because there's so much that's going on. Oh, and so sorry. I just remembered too, something that I also did was make sure to share resources that you know. I know for specifically undocumented youth, United We Dream has a lot of resources on their website when it comes to Know Your Rights, that comes in all sorts of languages. And I think they have some information on educators too that would be of use in a university campus.
Okay, awesome, thank you. And to Madison, I just kind of want to elaborate on one of the points you brought up, and what you brought up was fundraising. So I know a lot of our campus initiatives, at least I'm talking for OSU, I don't know about the other campuses, and we can open up discussion later to talk about that. But a lot of our initiatives are kind of educating our own campus about DACA and what the situation is. And so when you talk about fundraising, how did you go about doing that? Because you kind of have to make sure that some people are more educated about what they're donating money to. So can you kind of give a little bit of insight of how we can fundraise for emergency funds or to support the documented community?
Okay, so I'm going to say that I come from California, specifically Southern California, where they're the most undocumented immigrants in the entire country. So it's a little bit different than how it is in the Midwest, where most people have some understanding of the issue, or at least have known someone who is undocumented. So I think there's gonna be that problem for you, for like folks that aren't in the same situation. But I think, and this will you really need the help of folks who are undocumented, and I guess their consent too, and sharing and asking them to share their struggles, or at least share their stories, because I know for on our campus, the way that we would ask for support is that we would hold these things called ally trainings, right? So kind of going over the basics of the experiences of undocumented students. Kind of like, I think a lot of folks talked about struggling with money when it comes to finishing their education. And through there, it's like they go into detail on like not being able to afford books, not being able to have enough food. And I think it's like, I think it's pretty similar when applying to a scholarship, right? So you go into detail on what you would need that money for, but I think it's adding that extra, that like point that really hits nail on the head, is that there are no other financial opportunities for education when it comes to undocumented students. And like I can't remember which states have in-state tuition for undocumented folks, but for the most part, most states do not have financial aid for undocumented students. And I think making that point clear would be a pretty strong point for donors to donate.
I would also add, I mean, I think college students are fundraising and have experience in fundraising, right? When it comes from bake sales, when it comes to after sets. So I think like we have, as student organizations have the capacity to fundraise, it's a matter of like being able to, it's also like finding the organizations that are already doing the work locally within your community that may not necessarily be at the university level, but are community organizations raising money for students. So even as little as like being able to host a bake sale and all of that funds being donated to an organization that's already collecting funds for undocumented people. I think that's also another way to remove the pressures of the students having to engage with the issue educationally and just being able to pass it through to another organization that's already doing it. Because we do it all the time. I mean, student cultural organizations fundraise for different benefits all the time, right? Like we do this. So it's just a matter of being able to offset then. Instead of being able to fundraise for this fashion show, maybe we should think about putting this money towards something else that can actually benefit undocumented communities. So it's just a shift of perspective and a shift of intention when it comes to the funds that student organizations raise.
Speaking of which, do you know any organizations or campaigns that are currently in existence that we could contribute to?
Yeah, I mean, so there are different local community organizations that are probably going to be the most directly working with the communities y'all are a part of. And unfortunately, I don't have a list of like per state of different organizations, but I would recommend looking at just locally in your communities. Like, I mean, UPLIFT is an example of an organization that if you were just looking to donate to an organization that's working for undocumented API communities would be something where their mission and their work is and where the money goes to directly funds that. So I would just do some research in thinking about where locally. I would probably, as even though I work for a national organization, would probably steer you away from donating to a national organization, only because sometimes those funds don't necessarily get to the places that it should be directly. And I would rather you all find the local communities and the local organizations and local chapters of these national organizations to donate to.
Definitely, when it comes to local organizations, just because local organizations also don't have as many opportunities for funding the way that national organizations do. So definitely, if you were to give money to an organization, give to a local organization And there's a lot, for sure, there's a lot. From what I know, there's only 3 big undocumented Asian Pacific Islander, Asian American organization. One of them is UPLIFT, the other one is Aspire in San Francisco Bay Area, and Raise in New York. But that doesn't mean that there aren't local undocumented orgs that have undocumented Asian folks in there. And yeah, I mean, the local organizations are the ones that are doing the nitty-gritty work. They might be hard to find, but for sure they're around. And maybe like one way to start is like going off of like bigger organizations like Advancing Justice, and there's one in Chicago, and seeing what kind of what organizations they work with, what community organizations they work with, and from there just try to talk to different people and see who they know from different places.
Mm-hmm. What we can do is loop back in with Julie or whoever within MAASU to compile those lists of places that at least I know off the top of my head. I know in Chicago there's the Korean Resource Center, or HANA Center, excuse me, they're HANA Center now, who has been doing really great work, advocacy efforts on the ground. In Minnesota, I believe it's called Navigate Minnesota, that works with undocumented. And I only know those 2 areas because I went to school in Minnesota and in but we can definitely do some research on some of these, because I would hope there's opportunities locally.
Awesome, thank you guys. So to everyone, just a reminder, if you have any questions, go ahead and send those to Daphne Chang. And I think we can start getting into those questions that have been asked. So to our panelists, someone says, sorry if you addressed this already, but what is the status of the DREAM Act legislatively right now?
Yeah, I can take that one. So right now, the DREAM Act, right now, what needs to happen is it needs to go to the House boards. So the process essentially for a piece of legislation to be able to be voted on, it goes through, someone introduces it. So in this instance, we had Senator Durbin, and I'm forgetting his name off the top, but another senator introduced the DREAM Act on the Senate side, and then someone else introduced it on the House side. The usual process on the House side is that it has to go through committees where then people make changes to it, people add different pieces of legislation, and goes through this really lengthy process. And then from there is introduced to the floor on a vote. There's a lot more intricacies along the way, but that's kind of the basic path for different pieces of legislation. Right now, the call for the DREAM Act is for it to go on a vote as it's written and as it stands. Right now, as it's written, as it stands, while not inclusive of all 11 million undocumented communities that should be provided a pathway to citizenship, the DREAM Act of 2017, as it stands, doesn't harm any more communities because it doesn't have any attached enforcement. It doesn't have any attachment to increasing funding for the border wall. It doesn't have any attachment to increasing ICE agents or hurting sanctuary cities and so forth. So the DREAM Act, as it's written, would only really create a pathway to the 3 million folks without harming their families, you know, more than anything, their moms, their dads, their siblings, their grandparents. Right now, what's happening is Speaker Ryan is preventing the DREAM Act to go on to. Speaker Ryan is preventing the DREAM Act to be voted on the floor as it's written, and is forcing those who introduced it to go through this process, to go through an amendments process, to go through the committees. And what we know is that should that happen, and if that happens, that Republicans will then work to use that as an opportunity to add on the kind of anti-immigrant language that we all don't want on the progressive side. So right now, where it is, it's kind of in this deadlock of, Democrats are not moving on, at least right now, are not moving on their promise to us of passing a clean DREAM Act. Republicans are wanting to add enforcement measures to it. So where the fight exists is there's a vehicle to get the DREAM Act to a vote, and it's called the discharge petition. And it's very Beltway DC language on just essentially being able to force a bill on the floor without needing to go through this process. Right now, there's so far only one Republican that signed the discharge petition. If you're from Colorado, shout out to this Republican for being the only one that like is willing to do it. Because right now we're trying to get 23 more Republicans to sign on to the discharge petition to be able to put a vote on the floor. And what everyone's been telling us and what we've been saying, whether you believe it to be true or not, is if the DREAM Act were to go on the floor, apparently there's enough support for it that it would pass, more so than it has ever felt before. So shortly to answer, so that right now, that's where it's at. Right now, we are at a place where we have gathered enough public support, but need more, and it's just needing to push for it to actually be voted upon the floor without any added enforcement languages to it. And that's where calling your members of Congress, especially those who live in Republican districts, becomes really important, because it's a matter, like, we here in DC can talk to them and talk their ears off, but who they really care about listening to are their direct constituents that live in their districts. And you know, it's the Midwest has a lot of red districts that need some pushing. And I'm talking to people in Missouri, I'm talking to you Ohioans, I'm talking to you, where, like, there are places in the Midwest that is high targets, because we got some white Republican men that are trying to make decisions for us that we need, that need some pushing. And what we can do, and what I can forward to Julie and Allison, is just a list of the targets so that at least folks can know who those are. And if you live in those districts, you can make those calls and write letters and do email petitions and whatever it takes to push them. So at least on the legislative advocacy piece, that's kind of where DREAM Act is at right now.
And then just curious, when does Congress session end for the year?
December 8th. So our time is running. We are in a we're in a time crunch for this to happen.
All right. The second question is, are there any undocumented or DACA related statistics related to the APIA community?
Do you want to take it?
If I'm not mistaken, there's about 1.5 million undocumented AAPIs out of 11 million. For folks who have DACA, I can't remember exactly. I know there's 800,000 DACA recipients, and I feel like the number of AAPIs are a little bit, are like on the lower end. They're definitely on the lower end, just because there isn't a lot of attention to AAPI immigrants, and so there are usually not a lot of resources that get to those communities. But again, there's a lot of API orgs, the really big ones that push those. So I guess when it comes to if there's any big, like, if there are resources or any big, like, they're not going to exist anymore, but like immigration legal clinics, those are some things to boost in your networks, because otherwise there's no way for folks to hear about them.
For folks who want numbers, at least, so in terms of API populations, so the states with the highest API population, California, New York, Jersey, Texas, and then Illinois, has one of the highest DACA populations in the country of API folks. In terms of within the API community of who have most undocumented statuses, the top three are, I don't know in order, but Chinese communities, Indian communities, Filipino communities, and Vietnamese communities. some of the highest undocumented populations in the country. And then of the DACA folks who, of the 800,000 DACA people, 1 out of 7 of those, and I don't know that now, but 1 out of 7 of that 800,000. So for all of you STEM makers. So those are a little bit of the statistics around, but I think I wanted to just kind of elaborate on like this idea that I think one of the things that has always been true for API communities is the ways in which we deal with the stigmas around like some of these issues and the fear of coming out, not just because there's this sense of fear coming out, but a sense of like this model minority piece of not feeling like you've achieved a certain thing and being ashamed of what it means to be undocumented. I know at least when I found out I was undocumented, I was a junior in high school, and was fearful of talking about it because at the time didn't feel like I had a pathway to college, and in not having a pathway to college, felt like I couldn't share that with people. So it wasn't necessarily even being undocumented that made me fearful, but it was in not being able to tell people that I couldn't go to college. And then yes, those are directly connected, but it became more about like the focus on the lack of it, like the things that the lack of being able to achieve certain things that became really difficult when dealing with finding out about my status at that time. And I think there's a lot of connections between mental health and those who are undocumented. And I think as we know in the API community, we continue to struggle with stigmas around mental health. So the intersections of that to undocumented communities, to LGBTQ undocumented communities, to undocumented communities with disabilities, I think the intersections get even deeper. So it becomes a lot harder for different communities to be able to come out. And then add on to the layer of like, some of our families went through some of the worst experiences with war and experience with the government. So even the idea of like giving these information to the government, not only attached to like stigma of what that means, but there's, you know, the real fear around, I mean, we see it now, but the real fear around like, what does it mean for us to give all of this information to the government? What can they do to it? What, you know, so I think there's nuances to like, it seems small within the broader like 11 million of undocumented communities, even within like just the 800,000 documented folks. But I think it's important to understand the nuances of what it means to be API and undocumented and why those statistics are what they are. But to ensure that like, yes, undocumented people, whether they're out or not, when it comes to being to their status, like they exist and they're here and their experiences vary per community.
Yes, definitely. Thank you for sharing. And then we have another question on the table, which says, what sorts of things or narratives should you use to compel Republican congresspeople? While they do listen to their constituents, many of those constituents share the same stance on illegal immigration. I tried contacting my congressman about DACA. He didn't give me a definite stance other than everyone wants safe and secure borders. So the question is kind of asking, like, what kinds of stories would you share if you were maybe calling up your congressman or writing to your congresspeople? If you guys have any opinions on that.
I have my thoughts, but I want to let Madison share hers if she has any.
I don't have that many experiences dealing with Republicans being in California.
Yeah.
I'm gonna let Ken take this one and see if I can add anything along to this.
Yeah, no, for sure. So there's a couple of things to think about. One, undocumented communities, their value is not because of anything other than purely being here and being people, and that folks deserve that. And folks deserve kind of just the right to live in dignity and without fear. Granted, Republicans won't always listen to that, and they won't always hear that. And one of the pivot points that I think that the Republicans really value are pieces around the economy, and there are studies that have shown that people have been doing just around the GDP losses that we're going to face when we think about the number of DACA folks and the ways in which DACA has contributed to the economy, that $495 application that every person applying for DACA has to pay to even be able to even be able to maybe get work authorization. That's not even something that's for sure when you're applying, and you don't know that until it happens. But $495 times 800,000 for things that undocumented communities never get in return, right? Undocumented communities will never see retirement funds because the communities don't have access to that. When it comes to different states and access to healthcare, especially public benefits, there are states that continue to restrict that. When it comes to scholarships at universities, there are states that continually restrict these undocumented communities from having a hand, even though the money that undocumented communities have paved the way have increased our economy in more ways than one can count. So economic arguments is always one. I think another one when it comes to an argument against borders is one, thinking about again that there are undocumented communities that don't come from the border. And that's a tricky one because that's not meant to throw our community members who do cross the border under the table, but it's just a way to expand narratives that and to steer narratives away from purely just being about the border, because as we know within undocumented experiences that's not always the case. But I would say pivoting to economic factors is an important one. And then there are also studies that have shown around, should DREAM Act be passed and 3 million folks are able to get a pathway to citizenship, that in that the ability for different people to be able to work will immensely impact the kind of economy that Americans love to hear about. So Republicans and the economy is always a good start and good entry point to at least have a conversation that's away from like safety and security. And then it's also important to know that there are just some Republicans that you won't be able to move, and that's not your fault. And that's on them and being assholes. So.
And then another question is, does either of you have experience with sanctuary campuses and advocating for those kind of policies?
I'll let you take it.
Okay, so yeah, the University of California system was pretty big on kind of leading. They like to take the pride in like being the leaders, I guess, in expanding resources and supporting undocumented students. It's a little bit, it's like controversial. I guess it's like when you're actually a student, when you're like still struggling through problems, it's too big of a praise. But I did talk a lot with the administrators and with the president of the UC system on the kinds of support that could, when it comes to immigration enforcement, and a really big thing for basically what sanctuary means is that the university is not going to provide information to immigration enforcement if they were to ever ask for it. It doesn't necessarily mean anything about like immigration enforcement can't come on campus, because usually what universities throw at that is that these are public places, so anyone can come into them. And it doesn't mean anything either that just because you're a student that you're free from deportation. That's not what it means either. It really just means for both universities and cities is that information cannot be passed on to immigration enforcement. And it's actually really important because there's so many ways that ICE can get the information of people to track down where they live, to track down like where they work, where they go to school, and like if they come across these individuals, then they basically have the jurisdiction to arrest them right there and detain them. but when it comes to advocating for that, I think one, know the limitations that, again, like sanctuary really just means not being able to pass down that information. But I know, I can't remember if this is a federal law. I'm pretty sure it should be, but there's a policy called FERPA in universities that basically says that only students have the information, or basically information that universities have can only be released to the student, or like they have to get that student's consent to be released to anyone else, and that includes parents, that includes law enforcement, or anything that is basically not like public information. So I think when advocating for sanctuary universities, ask your administrators how they're reinforcing like privacy policies, and I think if you want to expand more on like being able to protect undocumented folks, something that I also dealt with on my campus was having to ask university administrators what to do if a student was to get detained. What kind of support is the university willing to give? Like when it comes to classes, or like making sure that like they don't get dropped, making sure that they're not like being charged extra because they're not even being a student, things like that. And if your university is particularly progressive, maybe finding ways to connect them to legal resources. I know in the UC system, we actually also provide legal services to undocumented folks, to immigrant communities, basically, who need immigration legal services. And so maybe a way also is that if your university has a law school, to build connections with folks who are doing immigration law and figure out how they can relay some of their knowledge and some of their resources onto folks who are directly affected.
And Ken, did you have anything to add?
No, I mean, I think what all Madison says is true. I think one thing I would add is that you should look into I think there are different ways to go about it at a public university versus a private university, just by nature of where the funding of different universities come from. And then I think from my understanding, sometimes it's harder to push for these things at a public university just because of where the funding comes from. But if you're at a private university, that there are just different pressure points to think about. And then one of my favorite quotes comes from Frederick Douglass, and it's that power concedes nothing without a demand. And that's something that as students, we have power as students at these universities, paying tuition in the mass amounts that we do. And I think thinking about like our organizations and the ways in which cultural-based organizations were founded, those came from students organizing and building and demanding for a space, and that we can also operate from that same lens to push for these sanctuary demands at the university level. All it requires is really for a group of students who truly believe in our passion and are able to see to the end that this happens, but that we recognize that as students we have the ability and the power to do so.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And that is actually all of the questions we have from the participants. To everyone else, if you have any questions, go ahead and just type them up right now and we can get to them. So because we don't have any questions at the moment, we have, what time is it? It's 7:58. Okay, so in the next 2 minutes, does anyone want to share any initiatives that's been happening on their own campuses regarding DACA? And our panelists can kind of comment or give suggestions if needed. So I just wanted to see if there's any initiatives being taken on your campuses already. If anyone would like to share. You can just raise your hand. CMU?
Hi. Oh, wait. Do you want to go in the middle? No, and I don't think it matters. I'll just sit down. Okay. Hi, I'm Tiffany, and this is CMU Fire Up Chips. Recently, last week, we had a DACA rally, which was basically kind of like a protest, except more informational, and that way this university police wouldn't worry as much. And it was actually really nice. We collaborated with about 7 other organizations that are cultural or just social justice or centered, and it was actually really cool. It was pouring that day and it was really windy out. It was like 40 degrees, but we still had some people come out, and it was really cool, and they shared their different initiatives. So I guess it was nice seeing that people cared enough to like stand out in the rain, miss class for it, and also stay for the entire thing, and having a speaker there, that was really cool. But yeah, thank you.
Yeah, that's awesome.
That's really awesome. People willing to stand in the rain.
Yeah, and I would say, I mean, for that, I mean, it then becomes about the follow up, right? How do you utilize that kind of energy?
Thanks for sharing. Does anyone else?
Yeah, so the Vietnamese Student Association.
Oh my god.
Okay.
So the Vietnamese Student Association is having a workshop next week, sort of about DACA and immigration, and so that'll be most of, like reps from organizations around our community. But I know that UMich is also a sanctuary campus. I don't know if it's like officially called that, but administration has like released statements saying like we support undocumented students. We have services for you. But they're basically not releasing anything.
What was the last part?
Oh.
Wait, Yumish, can you repeat that last part?
Hi, this is, yeah, so a couple weeks ago we had a big DACA rally with, I'm Adam, by the way. We had a pretty large DACA rally with the Latino and Latinx community. I want to say it evolved more into like a protest, but it happened outside the administrative building, just demanding more resources and things like that. And as far as I'm concerned, a lot of the administration actually came out and acknowledged the rally, which is something that hadn't been happening in sort of looking at a response from administration about DACA. There's hadn't been like a formal response yet. So that was something that was really encouraging. And then, yeah, Tiffany over here is doing the VSA workshop. It's going to be really powerful too. So.
Yeah, no, that's really great. I think similar to the other one, I think rallies are building, generating power, and then it's a matter of following up and ensuring that power is driven to activate for something. And then making sure that if administrators are showing up, that you are able to actually see tangible initiatives coming from them to ensure that their support aren't just words.
Thank you, Yumish. And anyone else to share out? I will say that on OSU's end, we haven't really done any like rallies or anything, but we did do a collective statement by all the APIDA organizations or API organizations collaborating on writing a statement regarding DACA and putting that out throughout all our social media. So at least getting the word out. And I think through listening to what Ken and Madison, you guys had to say about possibilities, I think at least speaking for OSU, we can take those initiatives into account and do fundraisers, book bake sales, things like that. Oh yeah, Diane?
Can y'all hear me?
Yes.
So I'm from the University of Georgia, and I'm actually one of the co-presidents of the here. And like because we have a board of regents policy that kind of overlooks like public universities, and undocumented students are actually not allowed to attend the University of Georgia. So we have this thing called the Undocumented Student Alliance, and we don't do direct actions, but we do have a couple of organizations locally that are like comprised of undocumented or undocumented students in the state. And we do kind of support that and follow barely. But some things that we've been doing a lot lately is just outreaching to organizations. We do a lot of like education. So I recently talked to like a Catholic Student Association meeting, the Student Association, so just really spreading the fact. First of all, like it's kind of like unbelievable like how much people like don't know about this issue. So just spreading the word, first of all, I think is really important. Something that is going on actually today is that we're having a movie screening along with the School of Social Work on a movie on undocumented student activists, and also having a panel after as well. A month ago, we have this thing called Freedom U that's based in Atlanta, and they are a kind of modern day freedom school for undocumented students. And they are actually doing a college tour right now, and we're part of the Georgia College Tour, and we have them come here and do a panel and kind of share their stories and their stories. I think just spreading the word and kind of just really educating your community, whether it's like the creative community or just your university as a whole, is super important. And we always do like fundraisers. We're having a bake sale next week, and that kind of all goes towards UAE. This is a local organization that supports them, kind of provides mentorship and scholarship for these students to college and have access to higher education. Yeah, something I really want to do is like, I feel like our APEDA population at UJ is not very active. So something I would really like to do, hopefully next semester, is have kind of one of these workshops on kind of immigration, DACA, things like that, kind of directing towards the APEDA population with like facts about how this, that's something that I'm kind of working with right now. And I'm hoping to kind of collaborate with the Asian Americans Advancing Justice Atlanta chapter. So I think collaboration overall is just really important to gain traction, things like that.
Yeah. Hey guys, I'm so sorry, but I have to go. My ride is here. But thank you guys for all taking your time.
All right, nice to meet you.
Thank you. I'm so sorry.
Diane left, but I just wanted to say, yeah, there's a lot of folks. Oh, there you are. But yeah, there's a lot of folks here in California that really appreciate the work that Freedom University does, because, you know, a lot of us from like undocumented students in California feel really privileged that we have the type of support that we do, and we have the like sort of opportunities that we do, but there's so much like that can be learned from the type of work that Freedom University does in places where there's a lot of hostility towards undocumented folks. And so, yeah, keep doing really good work and keep pushing as much as you can. I definitely say that collaboration is how I approach organizing. It's like the best way to build relationships that are meaningful and will go anywhere. So.
I guess something else we started last semester is we started this thing called the Progressive Action Coalition, and we kind of going off collaborations, we kind of had a meeting with a bunch of like social justice oriented organizations on our campus, because we were kind of pretty small, and just like having that like I guess like supporting each other, because like, you know, all of our issues are very interconnected, and I think forming that relationship is super important. So just like knowing that like we're not an isolated kind of group, and those bonds across.
Yeah, I think those sorts of coalitions are what basically holds up organizers, because without anyone else, you know, I feel like you all are like your biggest support networks. I know that was the same in the student population that I was at. It was really like the progressive folks who were always lifting each other up, and anytime there was an issue, anytime any sort of community or identity was being attacked, we would all gather together and rise up together. So it's a really powerful way of doing things.
Last call. Anyone else want to share out? Going once? Going twice? All right, and I see that there's no more questions that people have submitted. So thank you all so much for coming out to this town hall. Thank you to our panelists, Ken and Madison, for taking the time to speak to us about your experiences and giving us suggestions. Moving forward, we can post that list of resources. I think we could talk to Ken and Madison, we could talk, and we can maybe compile a list of resources and also release the notes, release the video that has been taken throughout this. We've been recording this in case you didn't know. So we can record, we can release that, we can release the notes, we can release resources. But moving forward, I'm excited to see what everyone's going to do on their campuses regarding activism surrounding any questions, any last words, or actually the panelists, do you have anything else that you want to share with us before we all log off?
Yeah, I really appreciate all the effort that you all are doing around the issue, and it seems like everyone is, taking action. I think one thing, this is me because of the type of person that I am also as an organizer, but I would always say keep pushing, never settle for what you have, because there's always there's always ways to improve it. And also feel free to reach out to me after this when it comes to maybe getting suggestions for, or like getting tips for type of action or the ways you're mobilizing. If you ever need any more resources, you can definitely reach out to me. And I can give my contact info to the folks that organize this and can give it to anyone who will ask for it.
Yeah, I'll echo the same thing and offer, I'll share my contact information. Folks, feel free to reach out and whatever kind of information. But thank you all. The Midwest is such a powerful place, and we always don't think of it as a powerful place. But there's so much power that can be derived from exactly where we are. I just want to reiterate and reinforce, sometimes when it feels like there's a drain in Midwest colleges and Midwest universities, that the power actually exists exactly where people are, and to draw power from each other and from the resources. Oh, Julie, you're muted.
Sorry. Thank you all so much for coming out, and I think we can call it a day. Yeah, thank you all. I'm going to stop the recording now.